I want to tell you about the 18 months that changed everything, not just for me, but for an entire department, a company culture, and one woman who had spent years operating as though the policies in the employee handbook were written for everyone except her. I'm going to tell it the way it actually happened because the truth is better than anything I could have invented. My name is Claire Merritt, and at the time this story begins, I was a senior compliance analyst at a mid-sized financial services firm called Hargrove Capital Partners. We weren't a giant Wall Street house, about 400 employees, 3 floors of an office building in downtown Charlotte, but we handled enough client money that the word compliance wasn't just a department name. It was the spine of the whole operation. If we got it wrong, people lost retirement savings. Regulators showed up. Careers ended. So you would think, in a place like that the rules would be taken seriously by everyone. You would think. I had been with Hargrove for 6 years by the time Diane Wakefield was promoted to Director of Client Strategy. 6 years of methodical work, of building my reputation one correctly filed report at a time, of eating lunch at my desk more often than I care to admit because I believed, genuinely and maybe naively, that if you did everything right, things would eventually go right for you. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't the kind of person who worked a room or remembered everyone's birthday. I was the person who caught the $2.3 million discrepancy in the Meridian account before it became a regulatory problem and then quietly wrote up the corrective procedure so it would never happen again. That was me. Steady, thorough, invisible in all the ways the institution needed me to be invisible. Diane was the opposite of invisible. She walked into a room the way some people walk onto a stage, with a complete assumption that everyone had been waiting for her arrival. She was charismatic in the way that is genuinely difficult to argue with in the moment, the kind of charismatic that makes you feel, while she's talking to you, that you are the most important person she has ever encountered. I felt it myself the first time we met, in the elevator on her second day. She asked my name, repeated it back to me with a warm smile, and said, "Claire, I have a feeling we're going to do great things together." I walked back to my desk feeling strangely elevated, which I now recognize as the first sign that I should have been more careful. Diane had come from a larger firm in Atlanta, recruited by our CEO, Marcus Elliott, who had worked with her a decade prior and apparently never stopped believing she was exceptional. That kind of executive sponsorship is a remarkable thing to witness up close. It creates a kind of force field. People who might otherwise raise their hands and ask a question instead pull those hands back into their laps and look at the table. I noticed it immediately. In her first week, Diane rescheduled 3 mandatory compliance training sessions because they conflicted with client calls. The training coordinator, a careful woman named Priya, sent me a concerned email. I told her to document it and flag it to HR. HR sent Diane a gentle reminder. Diane replied with a note saying she would reschedule, and then never did. That was the first thread. By her second month, there were more threads. Diane was routinely bypassing the pre-approval process for client gifts. At Hargrove, any gift to a client valued over $50 required documentation and sign-off from compliance, me, specifically, or one of my 2 analysts. It was a regulatory requirement, not a company preference. Diane was sending bottles of wine, sports tickets, restaurant gift cards. I only found out because one of her junior associates, a young man named Tyler, nervously stopped me in the hallway and asked if I had received the gift approval requests he had submitted on Diane's behalf. I had not. I checked the system. There were no submissions. Tyler looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. He told me Diane had instructed him to skip the portal and just keep a personal spreadsheet because the approval process was, and I'm quoting here, a bureaucratic relic that slows down relationship management. I want to pause here and tell you something about what it feels like to be in that position. Because I think people who haven't worked in compliance, or in any role where you are responsible for an institution's integrity, might assume it's easy to simply report a problem and move on. It is not easy. Diane had the ear of the CEO. She was beloved by the client-facing teams because she was winning business. The quarterly numbers that had been announced 2 weeks prior were the best the client strategy division had posted in 3 years, and Diane's name was attached to every one of those wins. When you are the person who has to look at that context and still say, yes, but you are accepting a certain amount of risk. You are accepting the possibility that you will be the villain of someone else's story. I documented everything Tyler told me. I went back through the records and cross-referenced with client communications logs to estimate the scope of the unapproved gifts. I found 17 instances over 6 weeks. The total value exceeded $12,000. I wrote it up cleanly, attached the supporting records, and submitted a formal compliance concern to our chief risk officer, a man named Gerald Oakes, who had been at the firm for 22 years and who I trusted completely. Gerald read it the same afternoon I sent it. He called me into his office, closed the door, and looked at me for a long moment before he said anything. "You're sure about this?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "Every line is sourced," I said. "I can walk you through it." He nodded slowly. "This is going to be uncomfortable." "I know," I said. "I think we have a regulatory exposure that's more uncomfortable." He agreed. He said he would handle it discreetly, which I understood to mean he would speak to Diane privately first, give her the opportunity to course correct. I went back to my desk and tried to focus on other things, which was more or less impossible. That evening, as I was packing up, I passed Diane's office. Her door was open. She was on the phone, laughing at something completely at ease, her feet actually up on the edge of her desk. She caught my eye and gave me that warm smile and a small wave. I waved back. I went home and did not sleep especially well. The private conversation with Gerald apparently did not go as had hoped. He told me the next day, with the careful expression of a man choosing his words with surgical precision, that Diane had assured him the gift documentation was being handled through a parallel tracking system her team had developed, and that she would ensure all records were transferred to the compliance portal by end of week. End of week came. Nothing was transferred. I documented that too. What happened over the next 4 months was something I can only describe as a slow escalation that felt, from the inside, like an experiment in how long a person can hold their nerve. Diane continued. "That's the only way to put it," she simply continued. The compliance training remained incomplete. The gift approvals remained absent. She began singing me on client communications in a way that I gradually realized was performative, designed to create the appearance of transparency, without its substance. She would copy me on an email about a client dinner, and then, if I followed up to ask for the gift approval, her assistant would reply on her behalf saying it was handled internally. I have a folder of those responses. I kept adding to it. The more alarming development was the expense reports. In month 4, one of my analysts, a sharp young woman named Becca, flagged an anomaly in the client strategy expense submissions. Several reports from Diane's team included reimbursements for client entertainment at venues and on dates that didn't match our client meeting logs. The amounts weren't enormous individually, a few $100s here, 1,000 there, but the pattern was consistent, and the discrepancy was real. Becca brought it to me with the careful, slightly scared energy of someone who understands what they've found, but isn't sure they want to have found it. I sat with that information for 2 days before I did anything.
I want to be honest about that.
I sat with it because I knew that once I moved on expense irregularities, we were in a different category of problem entirely. Gift approval violations are a compliance matter. Expense irregularities that suggest falsification are potentially a legal matter. I thought about Marcus Elliott and the way he talked about Diane in all-hands meetings like she was the best decision had made in years. I thought about the fact that I had a mortgage and a mother who needed help with her medical bills and a career I had built carefully over 6 years. I thought about all of those things, and then I went back to the documents, and I looked at the discrepancies again, and I knew that the only direction I could walk was forward. I contacted our outside legal counsel. Not through the normal internal channel, not through Gerald, directly, using the contact information available to all employees through the firm's ethics and compliance policy. I explained that I had concerns that rose above the level of internal resolution and that I wanted guidance on proper procedure. The attorney I spoke with, a measured woman named Sandra Park, listened to everything I said and told me 2 things. First, that I had done everything correctly so far. Second, that I should preserve every record in a format that existed outside the internal system and continue to document going forward. I went home that evening, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something that was almost like calm. Not because the problem was solved, it was very much not solved, but because I had made the decision that I would see it through, regardless of what it cost me professionally. Once you make that decision cleanly, there's a strange peace in it. I need to tell you about the meeting in October because that was the moment things shifted from slow burn to open confrontation. Gerald called Diane and me into a joint meeting. I wasn't told in advance that Diane would be there, ostensibly to discuss the compliance calendar for Q4. Within about 4 minutes, it became clear that the meeting had a different purpose. Diane, with the kind of composure that I now recognize as a practice performance, laid out what she described as her concerns about the compliance function's impact on client relationships. She said, smiling the entire time, that she had heard from several client-facing team members that compliance requests were creating friction in what should be seamless relationship management. She said she thought there might be value in reviewing whether certain processes were appropriately calibrated for a growth stage client strategy operation. I looked at Gerald.
Gerald looked at me.
I took a breath. I appreciate you raising that, I said, and am always open to process improvement conversations. But I want to make sure we're also addressing the open items I've submitted, which relate to regulatory requirements rather than internal preferences. The gift pre-approval process isn't something we have discretion to waive. It's a FINRA requirement. And I do want to have a separate conversation about the expense report discrepancies that my team has identified. The temperature in the room changed. Diane's smile didn't disappear, but it shifted, became something just slightly cooler. The warmth dialed back a single precise notch. She said she wasn't aware of any expense report discrepancies and would be happy to review whatever I was referring to. Gerald said he thought it would be best if we scheduled a follow-up specifically for that topic. We scheduled the meeting. Diane left the room with the unhurried ease of someone who believes the board is still tilted in her direction. She wasn't wrong yet, but the board was beginning to level. The follow-up meeting became a series of meetings, and the series of meetings expanded to include HR, and then the head of operations, and then, inevitably, Marcus Elliott himself. I presented everything in those meetings the way I have always done everything, clearly, with documentation, without drama, with the numbers and the dates and the source records attached. I did not editorialize. I did not say Diane was dishonest or calculating or that she had smiled at me in the elevator on her second day like I was someone who would be useful to her. I said, here is what the policy requires, here is what occurred, here is the documented gap. Here is what I believe the regulatory exposure to be, if this is not corrected. What I didn't know, during those weeks of meetings, was that Sandra Park had quietly initiated a preliminary review of the expense report concerns at the firm's request. I wasn't included in that process appropriately since I was both a witness and an employee, but I was aware it was happening. What I also didn't know, until it became visible in the way these things eventually always do, was that 2 other employees had come forward separately during that review, both from Diane's own team. One was Tyler, the junior associate who had first told me about the gift tracking spreadsheet. The other was a woman I didn't know well named Renata, who had been with the client strategy team for 8 months and who, according to what I learned later, had been asked by Diane to submit at least 3 expense reports she knew contained inaccurate venue information. Renata had kept copies of the original receipts. She had kept Diane's written instructions. I don't know what gave her the courage to come forward when she did, but I think about her sometimes, about what that decision cost her in terms of anxiety and sleepless nights and second-guessing, and I feel something close to profound respect. The external review took 11 weeks. 11 weeks during which Diane continued to come to work, continued to win client business, continued to CC me on emails as though nothing was happening beneath the surface of our ordinary days. There was a 2-week stretch in November where I was almost certain nothing would come of it, that the firm would find a way to credit the irregularities to administrative error, give Diane a quiet reprimand, and everyone would move forward with the understanding that some people are simply too valuable to hold to the same standard as everyone else. I've seen it happen. I've worked in enough organizations to know that the gravitational pull of revenue and executive relationships is a powerful force, and that compliance officers who push against that pull sometimes find themselves quietly reassigned, or made redundant, or just slowly edged to the margins until they resign. I kept documenting anyway. The morning the review concluded, Gerald called me at 7:45, before ID left for the office. He told me that the findings had been delivered to Marcus Elliott and the board's audit committee. He told me the findings supported my initial concerns, and then some. He told me that Diane's employment had been terminated effective the previous evening and that the firm was cooperating with a voluntary disclosure to the relevant regulatory bodies. He thanked me in the slightly formal way Gerald thanks people, which still managed to feel genuine. I sat in my car in my driveway for several minutes after I hung up the phone. I want to describe what I felt because I think people expect it to be triumphant, and it wasn't, not exactly. It was more like the way you feel when you've been holding tension in a muscle for so long that you've stopped noticing it, and then suddenly it releases. There was relief so deep it felt almost physical. There was grief, too, for something I can't quite name. Maybe for the version of this that didn't have to happen, where Diane had listened to Gerald's first quiet conversation and chosen differently. Maybe for the people on her team, who now had to navigate uncertainty and reorganization through no fault of their own. Maybe just for the cost of it, the months of tension and doubt and carefully suppressed fear. But underneath all of that, there was something else. Something steadier. The firm conducted an internal review of its compliance infrastructure following Diane's departure. I was asked to lead that review. We expanded the gift pre-approval process, digitized the audit trail, and implemented a quarterly attestation requirement for all directors and above, confirming their familiarity with the expense reporting policy. We also, with Sandra Park's guidance, established a clearer and more protected internal reporting channel for compliance concerns, one that explicitly guaranteed non-retaliation protections and provided employees with direct access to outside counsel for matters of significant concern. Priya, the training coordinator, who had been sending me concerned emails from the very beginning, finally got her mandatory compliance sessions on the calendar. They were attended by everyone required to attend them. Tyler was promoted within the client strategy team 8 months after Diane's departure. He stopped by my office on his first day in the new role, a little awkward, clearly not entirely sure what to say. He thanked me for taking what had told me seriously. I told him he was the one who'd said something when he didn't have to, and that mattered more than he probably knew. I think about this whole episode often, usually not when I intend to. It surfaces when I'm reviewing a new policy, or when I'm onboarding a junior analyst and explaining why the documentation requirements exist, and why we don't make exceptions for high-revenue relationships. It surfaces when I hear someone in a meeting say, half-jokingly, that a particular rule wasn't really meant for situations like this. I don't say anything dramatic in those moments. I just ask a clarifying question, quietly, and I write down the answer. The rules, in my experience, work best when everyone understands they apply to everyone. Not as an abstract principle, I know that sounds like a poster on a break room wall, but as a living, operational reality that someone is paying attention to and willing to defend, even when defending it is inconvenient, even when the person the rule applies to has the CEO's ear and a warm, disarming smile, and the quarterly numbers to back her up. Diane thought the rules didn't apply to her. She thought that long enough, and with enough apparent impunity, that I suspect she had stopped thinking about it consciously at all, that it had simply become the water she swam in. That's the thing about institutions that quietly look the other way. They don't just enable one person's behavior. They train that person to believe the exception is permanent. It isn't permanent. Nothing that depends on other people's silence is permanent. And sometimes, one person stops being silent, not dramatically, not with a speech or a confrontation, but just by opening a documentation portal and typing the date and writing down exactly what happened. That's usually all it takes. I'm still at Hargrove Capital Partners. I was promoted to Chief Compliance Officer 14 months after Diane's departure. I have a team of 7 now, including Becca, who is extraordinary, and who I am going to fight hard for when her review comes up in the spring. We have better systems, better protections, and a culture that, slowly, imperfectly, the way culture always changes, is beginning to understand that compliance is not friction. It is the skeleton that lets the whole body move. And every single person in this building, from the newest analyst to the most senior director, submits their gift approvals through the portal. Everyone.